The rain hit the pavement in steady sheets, turning the city streets into a symphony of muted sounds, sloshing tires, distant car horns, and the occasional hurried footsteps of late-night pedestrians. Barron Trump pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he stepped out of the black SUV, his security detail giving him a few paces of privacy. He had just finished a late dinner with some friends in Manhattan, nothing extravagant, just a quiet night away from the world that constantly watched his every move. That's when he saw her. Slumped against the side of a boarded-up storefront, huddled beneath layers of tattered blankets, was a woman he never expected to see like this. A woman who had once commanded a classroom with poise, wisdom, and unwavering kindness. His former teacher. Her face was thinner, hollowed by hardship, her once warm and expressive eyes now glazed over with exhaustion. A small cardboard sign rested beside her, its scrawled message barely legible in the dim streetlights. Hungry. Anything helps. God bless. Barron's heart pounded. He blinked, thinking maybe he was mistaken, that the shadows were playing tricks on him. But as she shivered against the night's cold grip, he knew, without a doubt, it was her. Ms. Fairchild. The woman who had once encouraged him to believe in himself. The woman who had stayed after school to help him grasp complex subjects when others had dismissed him as just another privileged kid. The woman who had made him love learning. And now, she didn't even recognize him. Ms. Fairchild. His voice wavered between disbelief and urgency. The woman stirred, lifting her head slowly, her expression weary and guarded. When her eyes finally met his, there was no sign of recognition, only confusion, as if she were trying to place him in the fragments of a life that felt worlds away. Then, in a voice that had once been so full of warmth but now carried the weight of brokenness, she whispered, Do I know you? Barron felt a lump rise in his throat. How had this happened? How had she fallen so far? More importantly, what was he going to do about it? 1 year earlier. The bell rang, signaling the end of another school day, and Barron Trump slung his backpack over one shoulder, strolling toward the exit of his private academy. Most students were eager to leave, already chatting about their plans for the weekend, but he lingered behind, watching as Ms. Fairchild erased the whiteboard with slow, methodical movements. Are you still staying late for tutoring? She asked without looking up. Barron hesitated before nodding. Yeah. I still don't get some of this econ stuff. She smiled at him, the way she always did, patient and understanding. That's what I'm here for. Barron had always felt like he was under a microscope. At school, he wasn't just another student. He was the student. The one whose last name carried a weight that never quite went away. People assumed things about him before they even spoke to him. They expected arrogance. Privilege. A kid who never had to try because the world was already laid out before him. But Ms. Fairchild? She treated him like a person, not a last name. And for that, he had respected her more than she ever knew. As she sat across from him, going over supply and demand curves for what felt like the 100th time, she made the subject make sense in a way no textbook ever could. She didn't just teach, she connected. You know, she said, tapping the edge of his notebook, understanding the economy isn't just about numbers. It's about people. About seeing beyond the statistics and understanding the real impact of wealth, poverty, opportunity, and misfortune. He remembered those words now, standing in the freezing rain, looking down at the woman who had once taught him so much, now reduced to a statistic herself. And he refused to let her become just another number. He was going to fix this. Somehow. But the question was, how? Barron stood frozen in place, rain trickling down his face, watching Ms. Fairchild as she clutched her damp blanket tighter around herself. The woman who once commanded a classroom with confidence now looked small, fragile, like the world had chewed her up and spit her out. How had this happened? He had so many questions, but none of them mattered right now. What mattered was what he was going to do next. His security detail, stationed just a few steps away, noticed his hesitation. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, took a cautious step forward. Mr. Trump, everything all right? Barron ignored him. Instead, he crouched down so he was at eye level with her. Ms. Fairchild. It's me, Barron. For a second, something flickered in her expression, like a tiny flame struggling to stay lit against a violent storm. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She shook her head, the rain dripping from the strands of her unkempt hair. I don't understand. Barron reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and grabbed a few crisp $100 bills. He held them out to her, his hand steady despite the whirlwind of emotions raging inside him. Take this. Please. She stared at the money like it was a foreign object, then looked up at him, something like shame clouding her expression. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Yes, you can, Barron insisted, pressing the cash into her trembling hands. Please, Ms. Fairchild. Just take it. For a moment, she did nothing. Then, with an almost robotic motion, she took the money, staring at it as if it might disappear at any moment. Barron let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But this wasn't enough. Not even close. He needed answers. He needed to understand how his former teacher, one of the smartest, most compassionate people he had ever known, ended up on the streets. Miss Fairchild, he said carefully, do you have somewhere safe to go? She hesitated, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head. His stomach twisted. His security detail was still watching, waiting. They weren't used to him stopping in the middle of the street to have a conversation with a homeless woman, especially not one who clearly meant something to him. Barron made a decision. Come with me, he said, standing up and offering her his hand. I'm not leaving you here. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to protest, but no words came out. Barron could see it in her eyes. She wanted to refuse. Not because she didn't need help, but because pride was a powerful thing. But so was desperation. After a long pause, she reached out and took his hand. And that's when Barron knew this was just the beginning. 1 year ago, Ms. Fairchild was one of those teachers who made a lasting impact on her students, not just through academics, but through the way she cared. She had been teaching at the elite private academy for nearly 10 years, and despite the wealthy, sometimes entitled students she taught, she never treated them as if they were better or worse than anyone else. For Barron, she had been a breath of fresh air. While other teachers seemed hesitant around him, unsure of how to handle the son of a president, Ms. Fairchild had never tiptoed around him. She never acted like his last name made him different from the other students in her class. She challenged him, pushed him to think critically, encouraged him to see the world beyond the golden bubble he had grown up in. But what none of her students knew, what Barron had only learned much later, was that Ms. Fairchild was struggling. Her job paid well, but life had a way of throwing curveballs that money couldn't always fix. Her mother had fallen ill, the medical bills piling up faster than she could pay them. Then came the accident. Her younger brother, a construction worker, had suffered a severe injury on the job. The medical expenses, legal fees, and emotional toll had drained her completely. And despite everything, she had still shown up to work every day, still given her students everything she had. Until the day she disappeared. Barron remembered when the school had announced her resignation. The students had been shocked. She left, one of his classmates had whispered. Just like that. There had been no warning. No goodbye. One day she was there. The next, she was gone. Rumors had spread, of course. Some students said she had moved to another state. Others claimed she had simply gotten tired of teaching. But the truth was far worse. And Barron was about to find out just how much she had lost. Barron sat in the back seat of the SUV, staring out at the blurred city lights as the vehicle weaved through the wet streets of Manhattan. The weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. Ms. Fairchild, his teacher, homeless? It didn't make sense. She sat beside him, silent, her fingers clutching the damp fabric of the coat he had draped over her shoulders. She hadn't spoken much since they left the alleyway. She looked embarrassed. Barron could only imagine what was running through her mind. She had once been the one guiding him, the one teaching him. Now, he was the one offering her a lifeline. The driver cleared his throat. Where to, sir? Barron hesitated. He hadn't actually thought that far ahead. Should he take her to a hotel? Give her enough money to get back on her feet? No. This wasn't just about a one-time fix. This was about understanding. Take us home, Barron said firmly. Ms. Fairchild's head snapped up. Barron, no, she said, her voice hoarse but determined. I can't. You can, he interrupted. And you will. She looked at him, eyes searching, but whatever argument she had died in her throat. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Right now, she needed help more than she needed pride. The SUV pulled up to the grand entrance of Trump Tower, its golden glow cutting through the rain. Ms. Fairchild stared at it with a mix of awe and hesitation. "This is temporary," she muttered as they stepped inside. Barron nodded, but he had already made up his mind. This wasn't going to be temporary. 30 minutes later, Ms. Fairchild was cleaned up and sitting on a plush chair in one of the guest suites. Barron had given her a change of clothes, one of his mom's oversized sweaters and a pair of leggings. She looked better, less like someone who had been sleeping on the streets. But the exhaustion in her eyes remained. A maid entered, setting down a tray of soup and bread before quietly stepping out. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Ms. Fairchild hesitated before reaching for the spoon. When she finally took a bite, her hands trembled slightly. She was starving. Barron watched her for a moment before finally speaking. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the spoon down and exhaled, staring at the surface of the soup as if it held the answers she was searching for. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I lost everything." Barron remained quiet, letting her continue at her own pace. "My mother got sick," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The medical bills were impossible. I tried to keep up, but no matter how much I worked, it wasn't enough." She paused, rubbing a hand over her tired face. "Then my brother got injured. His job wouldn't cover his medical expenses, and he had no insurance. I had to help him." Barron felt his jaw tighten. She had sacrificed everything for her family. And what had the world given her in return? "I drained my savings," she continued. "Took out loans. Sold what I could. But it wasn't enough. I started missing payments. Then I lost my apartment. I tried couchsurfing, but people have their own problems. Eventually," she swallowed hard. "Eventually, there was nowhere left to go." Silence hung between them like a thick fog. Barron could feel the anger building inside him, not at her, but at the system that had let this happen. A woman who had dedicated her life to teaching, to helping others, had been tossed aside like she was nothing. It wasn't fair, and he refused to accept it. Ms. Fairchild let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Funny, isn't it? I used to teach students about economics, about how the system works. And yet, I never thought I'd end up on the losing side of it." Barron shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You're not on the losing side. Not anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Barron leaned forward. "I don't know how yet," he admitted, "but I will fix this." And for the first time in a long time, Ms. Fairchild allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely lost. But neither of them knew that what was coming next would change everything. Barron barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with everything he had just learned. Ms. Fairchild, a woman who had once been his mentor, his teacher, had been abandoned by the very system she had spent years teaching about. How was that even possible? He turned onto his side, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his suite. The city stretched before him, glittering in the darkness, a stark contrast to the cold, rain-soaked alley where he had found her. A billion-dollar skyline. And yet, just a few blocks away, people like Ms. Fairchild were suffering in silence. Barron clenched his jaw. No. This wasn't right. He sat up, grabbed his phone, and started researching. He scrolled through article after article, reading about teacher layoffs, skyrocketing medical debt, the housing crisis. It was all connected. People like Ms. Fairchild weren't just unlucky. They were set up to fail. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, Barron had made a decision. He wasn't just going to help her get back on her feet. He was going to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Downstairs, Ms. Fairchild sat at the breakfast table, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. She looked different, cleaner, more herself. But there was still something in her expression, something guarded. She didn't trust this. Didn't trust that this wasn't some dream she'd wake up from at any moment. Barron sat across from her. "You're staying here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She sighed. "Barron, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't just—" "You can." He leaned forward. "And you will." She opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "I'm not giving you a handout. I'm giving you time." She frowned. "Time?" He nodded. "Time to get back on your feet. Time to figure out what comes next. No rent. No stress. Just time." Miss Fairchild stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a small, broken sound. "Do you have any idea how strange this is for me?" she asked, shaking her head. "A year ago, I was the one teaching you. Now you're— What? My savior." Barron met her gaze. "Not your savior," he said. "Just someone who refuses to let the world break good people." She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. "This is temporary," she muttered, echoing her words from the night before. Barron didn't argue, because he knew something she didn't. This wasn't temporary. This was the beginning. Over the next few days, Ms. Fairchild slowly started coming back to life. Barron made sure she had everything she needed: clothes, food, a quiet space where she could just breathe. But she wasn't the only one changing. Barron had started seeing the world differently. The privilege, the wealth, the security he had always taken for granted, it was a shield. A shield that protected him from the brutal reality that so many people faced every single day. And now that he had seen the truth, he couldn't unsee it. He started digging deeper, researching homelessness, education cuts, medical debt. The more he learned, the angrier he got. And then, one night, an idea hit him. A crazy idea. An impossible idea. But if there was one thing Barron Trump had learned in his life, impossible didn't mean can't. It just meant hasn't been done yet. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The call rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Dude, it's midnight," his friend grumbled. "Why are you calling me?" "I need your help," Barron said. "With what?" Barron took a deep breath. "I'm going to fix this," he said. "Not just for Ms. Fairchild, for everyone like her." His friend sighed. "Barron, what are you talking about?" Barron's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm going to change the system." And that's where things got crazy. Barron wasn't just another rich kid trying to feel good about himself. He had connections, resources, power, and he was about to use every single one of them. But what he didn't know, the deeper he dug, the more dangerous things would become. Because some people didn't want the system to change. Some people would do anything to keep it exactly the way it was. And Barron was about to become their biggest problem. What would you have done in Barron's situation? Do you think one person can actually change the system, or is it too broken? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the more. Barron knew that money alone wasn't the answer. Sure, he could write a check. Buy Ms. Fairchild a house. Give her enough cash to never worry again. But that wouldn't change the fact that the system had failed her. And if it failed her, it had failed thousands, maybe millions, of others. This wasn't just about saving one person. This was about fixing the machine that kept breaking people. And Barron Trump was about to shake that machine to its core. The next morning, he walked into the Trump Tower office space, phone in hand, his mind buzzing with ideas. He needed a plan, a team, and most importantly, information. He had connections that most people didn't. CEOs, investors, lawmakers, people who ran the world. So he called them, one by one, not as Barron Trump, the president's son, but as Barron Trump, the guy who wasn't going to let this stand. Some of the calls were met with interest, others with skepticism, a few with outright dismissal. "Barron, you can't fix homelessness," one executive scoffed over the phone. "It's not a money problem, it's a people problem. Some folks just don't want help." Barron clenched his jaw. Ms. Fairchild wanted help. She had just been abandoned when she needed it most. Then why are there homeless teachers? Barron shot back. Doctors? Veterans? Are you telling me they all chose this? Silence. And then, the guy hung up. Good. If they weren't willing to listen, they weren't part of the solution. By the end of the day, Barron had a list. Some people wanted to help. Others didn't want anything to change, which meant he was on the right track. But he wasn't just relying on the wealthy elite to solve this. If there was one thing Ms. Fairchild had taught him, it was that real change didn't come from the top down. It came from the ground up. So that night, he did something no one expected. He went back to the streets. Dressed in plain clothes, no security detail, no cameras, no fanfare, Barron walked through the cold streets of Manhattan. He needed to understand. Really understand. The shelters. The food banks. The places where the city's forgotten tried to survive. And what he found shook him to his core. A man in his late 50s, a former firefighter, living under a bridge because his medical bills had wiped out his savings. A single mother with 2 kids who had been evicted because her landlord raised the rent overnight. A young man his own age who had aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go. These weren't people who had made bad choices. They were people who had been failed. Barron felt sick. This wasn't just a problem. This was a crisis. And he was done waiting for someone else to fix it. The next morning, Ms. Fairchild found Barron sitting at the kitchen counter, surrounded by papers, notes, and laptop screens. "What are you doing?" she asked cautiously. Barron looked up, his eyes burning with determination. "Starting a revolution," he said. She blinked. "Okay, dramatic much?" He smirked. "Maybe." Then he turned the laptop toward her. She leaned in, eyes scanning the screen, and froze. She shook her head. "You're setting up a fund?" "Not just a fund," Barron corrected. "A full-blown initiative. Housing, medical relief, job placement. Everything people need to get back on their feet." Ms. Fairchild sat down, her expression unreadable. "Barron, this is huge." He nodded. "It has to be." Her eyes flickered with something, hope. And for the first time since he had found her, she believed. But Barron had no idea what was coming next. Because the moment he stepped into this fight, he made enemies. Real ones. Dangerous ones. And someone, somewhere, had just decided that Barron Trump needed to be stopped. Barron didn't realize he was being watched. Not at first. He was too caught up in the mission, making calls, drafting proposals, setting up meetings with investors who actually cared. The initiative was gaining momentum fast. Too fast. And someone didn't like it. It started subtly. A blocked number calling his phone at odd hours. Emails disappearing from his inbox. Then, one night, as he was heading home from a late meeting, a black SUV followed his car for 20 blocks. His security detail noticed. "Mr. Trump, we've got a tail," the driver muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror. Barron's stomach tightened. "Lose them," he said, keeping his voice steady. The driver took a sharp right. Then another. Then sped through a yellow light. The SUV didn't stop following. Only when they pulled into Trump Tower, where security was already waiting, did the car finally slow down and disappear into the night. Barron sat in the back seat, pulse pounding. This wasn't paranoia. Someone didn't want him doing this. And they weren't just going to stand by and let it happen. The next morning, Ms. Fairchild found him in the kitchen again, eyes glued to his laptop. He was reading an article. More specifically, he was reading about people who had tried to change the system before, and what had happened to them. Some were discredited. Some were ruined. And some disappeared. Ms. Fairchild sat down across from him, setting her coffee cup down with a quiet clink. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I didn't," Barron admitted. She frowned. "What's wrong?" Barron hesitated. Then he exhaled sharply. "I think someone's trying to scare me." Ms. Fairchild went still. "What do you mean?" Barron told her everything. The calls. The SUV. The emails that kept vanishing. By the time he finished, her face had paled. "Barron," she swallowed. This isn't just some charity. You're going after the system itself. And the people who benefit from that system. They don't want it to change." Barron leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then they should be scared of me." Ms. Fairchild searched his face, like she was trying to decide if he really understood what he was up against. After a long silence, she sighed. Then we do this the smart way. That afternoon, Barron made a new kind of call. Not to investors, not to businessmen, but to someone who knew how to deal with threats. His father. Donald Trump wasn't an easy man to impress. But as Barron laid out everything, the plan, the threats, the growing resistance, his father listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't brush it off. And when Barron finally finished, Trump leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're making noise," he said simply. Barron nodded. "Good." Trump smirked. "Bad." Barron frowned. His father sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're not just messing with politicians or corporate execs, kid. You're messing with money. And people who have money." His expression darkened. "They don't play fair." Barron already knew that. "I don't care," he said. Trump studied him for a moment, then chuckled under his breath. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious." Trump sighed, then picked up his phone. "What are you doing?" Barron asked. "Making sure no one buries you before you even get started," Trump muttered. And that's when Barron knew. Things were about to escalate. Fast. That night, Barron got another call. Blocked number. He let it go to voicemail. Then he played the message. A low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "Back off." A pause. Then, softer, almost amused. "Or we'll make you." Barron stared at his phone, the voicemail still echoing in his mind. "Back off, or we'll make you." He clenched his jaw. His grip on the phone tightened. Whoever these people were, they weren't just trying to scare him. They were testing him, seeing if he'd fold. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The next morning, Barron called a meeting. Ms. Fairchild, his personal security team, and a few trusted friends gathered in one of the private lounges inside Trump Tower. The air was thick with tension. "What's going on?" Ms. Fairchild asked. She was already uneasy after hearing about the strange phone calls. Barron didn't sugarcoat it. "I got a threat last night." Silence. "Then, what kind of threat?" one of the security officers asked, his expression unreadable. Barron played the voicemail. When it ended, no one spoke for a moment. Ms. Fairchild's hands curled into fists. "These people," she shook her head, voice thick with anger. "They think they can just erase anyone who challenges them." Barron exhaled sharply. "Let them try." His security lead, a former military operative named Cole, leaned forward. "Mr. Trump, I say this with all due respect. This isn't a game." "I know it's not a game," Barron shot back. "That's why I need to know who's behind this." Cole nodded slowly. "Then we start digging." Barron turned to his best friend, Jason, a tech genius with a knack for uncovering things people wanted hidden. "Think you can trace the call?" Barron asked. Jason smirked. "Does a bear?" "Just say yes," Barron muttered. "Yes." Hours later, Jason had results. And they weren't good. Whoever made that call covered their tracks well. Jason tapped his laptop screen. Bounced through multiple servers. Military-grade encryption. This wasn't some random guy in his basement. These are serious people. Ms. Fairchild swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Jason hesitated. "Then, it means Barron didn't just piss off a rich businessman. He pissed off someone who operates in the shadows." Barron met Jason's gaze. "Then we bring them into the light." Jason exhaled. "Man, I really don't want to be on this ride, but I also really want to see how it ends." The next day, Barron doubled down. If they wanted him to back off, he'd do the opposite. He released a press statement announcing the launch of his initiative to fight homelessness and economic injustice. Within hours, the media exploded. Barron Trump takes on America's homelessness crisis. The first son wants to fix what politicians won't. Barron Trump versus the system. Can he really pull it off? Millions of people saw it. The support poured in. But so did the enemies. That night, as Barron scrolled through news articles, he noticed something disturbing. Social media was suddenly flooded with rumors about him. Some claimed he was only doing this for attention. Others twisted his words, making it seem like he was attacking his own family. Then came the fabricated scandals. Anonymous accounts started spreading stories, fake headlines about Barron being involved in shady business deals, about fraud, about blackmail. None of it was true. But it didn't matter, because this was how they played the game. They couldn't stop him with threats, so they were trying to destroy his credibility. Ms. Fairchild stormed into the room, phone in hand. "Have you seen this?" she demanded. "I've seen it," Barron muttered. "They're trying to bury you," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Barron looked up at her, fire in his eyes. "Then we dig deeper." But what he didn't know, he was about to uncover something that would shake the entire country. Something that could get him killed. The deeper Barron dug, the more dangerous things became. By now, it was clear, this wasn't just about homelessness. It was about power, corruption, control. Someone, or some group, had built an empire on keeping people like Ms. Fairchild down. And they would do anything to keep it that way. But Barron, he wasn't stopping. It started with a single document. Jason found it, buried in an obscure government database, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. A contract. One that detailed a massive real estate deal between corporate investors and city officials. The goal? To buy up low-income housing, evict tenants, and turn the properties into luxury developments. Barron's stomach turned. "This isn't just gentrification," he muttered. "They're manufacturing homelessness." Ms. Fairchild looked at the document, horrified. "They're literally throwing people onto the streets, for profit. And the worst part? The deal had been approved by people in power. Politicians, CEOs, household names. People who went on TV and pretended to care about homelessness, while secretly making money off of it. Barron's blood boiled. No more games. No more waiting. It was time to blow the whole thing open. The press conference. Barron stood at the podium, cameras flashing, microphones recording. Millions of people were watching. This was his moment. "Homelessness isn't an accident," he began, voice strong and unwavering. "It's not just about bad luck or bad choices. It's about a system designed to keep people down, while the wealthy profit." He held up the document. "This is proof." The crowd gasped. Reporters leaned in. "This contract shows that powerful corporations and government officials have been working together to displace vulnerable communities. For money. They're not fixing homelessness. They're creating it." The room erupted. Shouts. Questions. Chaos. And then, the lights flickered. A low buzz filled the air. Jason's phone screen glitched. Then, blackout. The entire building lost power. For a single second, there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single gunshot. Screams. People ducked. Security rushed forward. Barron was pulled off the stage, his security team surrounding him. "This was a mistake," Cole muttered, shoving him into a waiting SUV. Barron's pulse pounded. It wasn't just threats anymore. They had tried to kill him. 1 week later. The attempt on his life only made things worse, for them. The story exploded. Every news outlet in the country covered it. The leaked documents went viral. Public outrage spread like wildfire. Investigations were launched. Officials resigned. CEOs vanished. And just like that, the system started to crack. Ms. Fairchild stood in the doorway of her new home. A modest house, not a mansion, not a penthouse, but a home. She turned to Barron, eyes shimmering with gratitude. "You did it," she whispered. Barron shook his head. "We did it." Because it wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. The forgotten. The ignored. The people who had been cast aside. They weren't invisible anymore. They weren't voiceless. They had started something. And the world would never be the same.